Hey, welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel here with Dad.
And I'm Rick. What do you want to talk about today, Joel? What's up?
Well, first of all, I got people writing saying you didn't post a podcast on Thanksgiving. We didn't.
We didn't.
Part of that's because we got behind because Dad, you just got back from Guatemala.
I did. Shame.
Yeah, he was in Guatemala for, you were down there for like 2 weeks, weren't you?
2 weeks. Took some of our staff and board members down to let them meet some of the missionaries they help out. So
that's pretty good.
It was good. It was long. I was ready to come back.
I highly advised him against driving while he was down there, but in classic Dad fashion,
It's great. I love driving there. You don't have to worry about all the rules. Here, there are just too many rules you have to worry about. But down there, I just love it.
Yeah.
I'm not a rules guy.
It ain't the Guatemala I learned to drive in, that's for sure. Now when we go down there, I'm just like, I'm getting a driver. This is crazy.
It is a little crazy.
So, yeah. Okay, well, we were going to talk about something. Actually, one of our listeners was commented on in person. We got to see our listener.
Yeah, our listener.
We have multiple listeners. Somebody wrote me and said, "Don't say that about your show. You have a lot of listeners." And I was like, "Yeah, I know. It's a little inside joke that we have like one listener, but we have." Anyways,
and it doesn't include any of our close friends.
Yeah. On that note, by the way, shameless self-promotion. We are trying to build the YouTube channel and all the platforms. So if you would add us on social media, you can add Rick Malm, Joel Malm. Do you post clips of this? You don't. We need to get you posting clips of this.
I should.
And then on the YouTube, youtube.com/Joel Malm, and then like and subscribe. You're probably watching it actually on there right now. But if you have not liked and subscribed, that really helps us. If I can get up to 1,000 followers on YouTube, it opens up a lot of options that we did not have before. So topic today. All right. So this was the listener. We were talking about the idea that, you hear these miraculous stories of people who like were hooked on drugs or alcohol or, pornography or something. They come to Christ and literally like in an instant, the desire, the addiction is taken away, and how those stories tend to kind of mess with your head if
it didn't happen for you.
Yeah.
If you maybe still struggling with things like I think most of us are.
Yeah. So first of all, I would venture to say instant deliverance from, what do they call that? Instant deliverance from sin?
Whatever.
Obviously
from sin.
Yeah. Obviously we are instantly delivered from sin when we accept Christ.
Yes.
We're justified by grace.
Right.
We're forgiven of all of our sins, but then there's still these old patterns, right? Then you've got these patterns you're trying to conquer. But I think that's not the norm, the instant deliverance from these habits and patterns. But so first of all, why do you think he lets some people get instantly delivered? For example, Marcus, the pastor that I serve with at Crossroads Church, man, he was just literally radically delivered from, I think he even was popped out of he was high or something when he got saved, and all of a sudden he was wide awake and everything. But
it's an amazing story.
Why do you think he does that for some and not for others?
Well, first of all, what you're talking about, there is that deliverance from sin. As somebody put it, I think, and this really clarifies what happens. We are immediately delivered from the power of sin. Previously, we have no choice. And then we're immediately delivered from the penalty of sin. We work on being delivered from the power of sin. Mm-hmm. And then one day we'll be delivered from the presence of sin. So we'll be in the presence of the Lord, and there'll be no more of that. So right now, the penalty we've been delivered from, you don't have to worry about that. We're still dealing with the power of it. And I know in my case, I remember one time where I was kind of thinking about somebody was saying that it happened. And I said, Lord, man, I'm still struggling with this, still struggling with that. And how come this doesn't happen? And I just felt like the Lord said, if I immediately delivered you from it, you'd have such a problem with pride and looking down upon those that are still struggling with that I can't afford to do that for you. So I said, okay, Lord. So it's kind of like Paul, where you embrace the thorn in the flesh and say, okay, I'm going to embrace that. His grace is sufficient. And just recognize that this struggle I have with it and the fact that I'm still fighting against my old nature just reminds me that I once, I still look forward to. One of my favorite passages is 1 John. I think it's chapter 3, verse 1. But he says this. He says, right now, we are children of God, but it doesn't yet appear what we shall be, because when we see him, we will be like him, because we'll see him as he is. And that is the great hope that I have in my life is, okay, I may still be struggling with sin right now. I may still not be what I want to be, but one of these days I'm going to see him, and I will be like him, for I'll see him as he is, whatever that means. I'll see him for like he is. But the idea that I'll be like him. So I think it has to do with humility, for one thing. At least in my life it is. That if it all happens so fast, it'd be hard to have grace for someone who's still struggling with it. That makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Paul is saying. You mentioned 2 Corinthians 12. That is 2 Corinthians. I got rebuked recently for putting 1 Corinthians on a verse that was in 2 Corinthians.
If that's the worst we did,
Yeah.
You may figure out we guessed at a lot of these.
This old lady came at me one time and she was like, you put on the screen 1 Corinthians, but it's 2 Corinthians. I looked it up and I'm like, well, I got a lot of friends. Sometimes I don't get all their addresses right. And she's like, the address is pretty important. I was like, wow, do we call this religious spirit or is this just the teacher spirit? Anyway.
Yes, a helpful spirit. They're being helpful, Joel.
For clarification, for all you religious uptight people, it is 2 Corinthians 12 where it says, so basically Paul's saying he had these supernatural revelations that have been given to him. He says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, which 3 doesn't seem like many times. I've pleaded thousands of times for my issues. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me.
Obviously that wasn't sin. That was a messenger from Satan that was sent to buffet him.
What it makes me think of is I was listening to somebody the other day and they said that, God, we always say about God likes to use untalented people. And he's like, actually, God really likes to use talented people. But he said talented people, they have to die a lot more before God can use them.
Yeah.
And you think about Paul, he was a highly talented person. I mean, he was the cream of the crop. He was the tops in his time. And then the idea that, it's not that God doesn't use, David was the same way. Yeah. David was very talented. He was a musician. He was a warrior. He was clearly good at everything he did. And then he had to go through this whole season of Saul, going after him. And I always wondered why that was. And that when he said that speaker, I can't remember who it was, he said that, I was like, man, that's pretty potent because what it's saying is God will use talented people, but he often has to wear them down a little bit more so they're not dependent on themselves. And oftentimes you see that the most talented people have a fatal flaw.
Yeah.
We're seeing that right now with so many of these Christian organizations that are just tanking.
Yeah.
And there were fatal flaws in the foundation. And man, as soon as humility obviously holds it together.
Yeah.
But if that humility is gone, it can really quickly, those flaws are revealed. And instead of boasting in your weakness and coming out and saying, yeah, we've got this flaw, I think people would be more gracious at that than trying to cover it over.
Yeah. Yeah, the seeds of the destruction of every organization are laid in the foundation of that organization when the foundation is laid. So if you don't lay a good foundation, and that's what happens, you got a weak foundation, it builds, and then whenever the enemy's ready to, he can pull it out and expose the weakness in that foundation and destroys the whole thing.
Which is why I guess at a personal level, oftentimes it's in the struggle with conquering those ingrained habits or sins or addictions that you stay humble, and it actually strengthens you to be the kind of leader you need to be.
Yeah.
Because again, don't trust a leader that doesn't walk with a limp.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I don't know if it would be, is that, you could say, well, that's the problem with the church. They expect all their leaders to be perfect. And I'm not sure that's the case. Or is it the problem of the leader who just doesn't want to expose a fear of, well, if they really knew who I was, they wouldn't follow me.
Which is why I think it's important that Paul says, I boast in my weakness.
Yeah.
Because which is weird, I have hated it because you see some people are like boasting in their weakness, but they're really not boasting in their weakness.
Yeah,
they're actually boasting about how awesome they are. I remember a pastor going, he's like, well, you guys don't pay attention to our amazing facilities. I know they're incredible, but God gave them to us. But I didn't do anything and I designed it, but it's just don't pay attention to those things. Pay attention to God. And you're like, come on, dude. It's okay to admit you designed a cool building and God provided for it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, what you were saying earlier too about, I particularly focus a lot on the fact that God uses ordinary people, Peter and James and all those were, and that is great and that is true. But for those of you who say, well, that leaves me out because I have got some education, I do have some skills, I do have some talents, you realize that the New Testament, the majority of the New Testament was not written by Paul. The majority in volume-wise was written by Luke. Luke and Acts are longer than all of Paul's letters put together and everything else. But the two people who wrote the most were Paul. A little bit of Bible trivia for you there. The two people who wrote the most were Paul and Luke. Paul, very highly educated, and Luke, a medical doctor, and neither were guys that wandered around with him that we know of as one of the 12.
Yeah.
So God will use the tools that are available. But again, we don't know what humbling Luke had to go through. But we do know what Paul had to go through.
But there is a very good chance. I don't know, man. Maybe that's part of the process, that if you are a highly gifted person, you're not going to be immediately delivered from whatever it is, because you need that thing constantly tormenting you to keep you. Hey, maybe that's the encouraging word. If you're having a hard time beating something, maybe it's because you're special.
You're very special.
No, but seriously, if you're having a hard time conquering some sort of a habit or something, there's a very good chance that it's part of what God wants to use to keep you humble and keep you,
Well, the other thing, there's a psychiatrist wrote a book years ago. He had been down on Alcoholics Anonymous because he went his psychiatry training, all that's nonsense, and then he got out and he went into mental hospitals and he found everything he'd been taught in school didn't work. And so he had to kind of humble himself. And he was a Christian guy. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Kingdom of Self. It's an oldie, but a goodie. It got a very simple premise. But what he found out was that the reason most people, that sin kind of lays, he put it this way, like a dog laying at your heels, that at any moment when you kick it, it can come back in its full fury. And when he started teaching that, and he began to realize, people would say, well, no, you're saying God doesn't deliver you fully. He says, no, God delivers you fully, but that sin is still there. And he felt for the purpose of keeping you humble and keeping you dependent upon the Lord. And so it's like the guy, because I've had things where, wow, I felt like I was delivered from something. Oh, wow. And I'd be going along for 2 or 3 months, and all of a sudden the thing's back in its full fury. The temptation is there in its full fury back again, and you go, man, what was that all about? I thought, so his premise was, and I think it's been true in my life, is that thing is still laying there. It's like a dog at your feet. It's a sleeping dog. You can kick it at any moment, and it can come back in its full fury, which ties in with what they know about, like, alcoholics. I was just talking with somebody this morning. They don't like the idea that, well, I am an alcoholic. Well, you're a new creature. Yeah, I am a new creature, but those old tendencies and propensities are still there if I feed them, if I allow them to. Does that make sense?
No, yeah. I've wrestled with that, because I've heard people say that, that's the problem, is acknowledging the rest of your life you're an alcoholic keeps you in this. Which,
I agree.
If anyone's in Christ or a new creation, I think it's yes and also.
I'd agree.
It's yes, I am that, and also I've risen above that, and I'm not going back to that. So it's yes, you start with it's salvation. You start with the recognition. I'm a sinner. I have a very strong propensity to sin.
Yeah.
I really like sinning. And then you recognize, but I'm also aiming for the ideal. I'm not going to identify as a sinner anymore, and I'm going to arise above that. And I think that's how the victory comes.
That's the 1 John again. We are right now children of God, but it does not yet appear what we shall be. Because if this is it, right now I'm a child of God and this is all there's going for me, I'm going, wow, I'm kind of disappointed. But it doesn't yet appear what we shall be. And so, yeah, exactly what you're saying. I am still, but this is not all there is to it. I am a new creature also.
Which I think is encouraging if you're struggling with addictions, habits, sins, welcome to the club. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with you. The aberration is God immediately delivering people from it.
That is the rare, and sometimes you wonder if that just doesn't make for a better testimony, especially if it's in a public speaking type of, maybe I'm a little cynical, but there are definitely those ones where it happens. But for most of us, and even those that have that, they have other things that they're struggling with. So for all of us, we're still in the fight. We're still running the race. And one day we'll cross that line, but until then, it does not yet appear what we shall be.